When the Spencers met the monarchy, it should have been the ideal union of two noble families.
The Spencers were perfect royal in-laws. They were blue bloods, British aristocracy. On paper, they couldn't have been better.
When they became engaged, the Queen said, "Oh, she's one of us."
But these two blue-blooded families were on a collision course.
The Spencers and the Windsors, it's been, at times, the clash of the titans.
This film will shed new light on the colourful, controversial Spencer family.
Diana's stepmother, Reine, was an absolute force of nature.
Two families both very similar and very different.
The Windsors wouldn't express their emotions, whereas the Spencers expressed it in volumes, catastrophically sometimes.
Featuring insider accounts and recently unearthed footage,
I've never seen her show her dissatisfaction on camera before. It's a most remarkable piece of footage.
we go behind the scenes of the ultimate family fallout.
Emotions were running very high.
It was unconventional, it was rebellious, it was all the words that you come to associate with the Spencers.
The rift between the Spencers and the Windsors had become a gulf.
And reveal how the Spencer family changed the House of Windsor forever.
Without the Spencers, the Windsors wouldn't be the family they are today.
When Charles Spencer went to the pulpit, we expected it to be emotional, but his eulogy was explosive.
I stand before you today, the representative of a family in grief, in a country in mourning, before a world in shock.
In front of the royal family and a global television audience of billions, Diana's younger brother launched into a devastating attack on the House of Windsor.
I thought, oh my goodness, he's actually damning the royal family.
I pledge that we, your blood family, will do all we can to continue the imaginative and loving way in which you are steering these two exceptional young men.
It was critical of the monarch to her face, critical of the royal family to their faces.
So that their souls are not simply immersed by duty and tradition, but can sing openly as you planned.
Earl Spencer's eulogy was an extraordinary act of rebellion.
For centuries, there had been a strong alliance between the Spencers and the Windsors.
Charles Spencer, making this eulogy, was looking across the coffin of his sister towards the Queen, and the Queen is his godmother. That's how closely bound the Windsors and the Spencers are.
Earl Spencer's emotional eulogy laid bare the differences between the Spencers and the royals. Differences that had existed from the moment the families first met. Back in 1980, the press were desperate to find out anything they could about a young English aristocrat called Lady Diana Spencer.
From the moment she was pegged as a girlfriend of Prince Charles, Diana's life had been turned completely upside down. She'd gone from being just a regular girl about town, albeit a very upper-class one, to suddenly the centre of media attention. It was absolutely overwhelming.
While the world might have only just learned her name, the royal family knew the Spencers well, very well. And as a Spencer, Diana would make more than a suitable spouse for the heir to the throne.
Diana came from a truly aristocratic family. The Spencers go back centuries, you know, and had been part of the nobility of this country for a very long time.
The Spencers of Althorp came to prominence in the 15th century, when their enormous fortune brought them an earldom from Charles I. For the next 300 years, the Spencers were regulars at the royal palaces.
You can look to almost every generation and you'll see that there's a connection between the Spencers and the Windsors. Both of Diana's grandmothers served the Queen Mother in one way or another.
In many ways, Diana was more royal than the royals. She could trace her ancestry back to the first Tudor king, Henry VII, She could trace her ancestry back to James I. Her blue blood was absolutely impeccable.
Diana was proud of her heritage. She always used to refer to the House of Windsor as the Germans because her family, the Spencers, had been in Britain for many, many years before the Windsors moved from Germany. So there was that kind of generational snobbishness that her family was, if not as grander than the royal family.
Centuries later, the Spencers and the royal family remained close. So close, in fact, that Diana wasn't even the first of her sisters to date the prince.
In 1977, the prince was dating her elder sister, Lady Sarah, and had been invited by Sarah and her father to join a shoot on the Althorpe estate.
Sarah had the Spencer red hair. She had the most fiery temperament. She knew exactly what she wanted. She certainly gave Prince Charles a bit of a runaround.
But Sarah had soon blown her chances when she gave a candid interview to the press.
What goes on within palace walls stays within palace walls. And to break that rule so openly was a fatal mistake by Sarah.
While Sarah and Charles's budding romance was over, the relationship between the Windsors and the Spencers ran much deeper.
Diana's father, Johnny Spencer, had been an equerry in Australia when the Queen made a very long tour early in her reign. Johnny Spencer was about as dim as an aristocrat can possibly be. His commanding officer in the army had said that if you set his trousers on fire, it would take him 10 minutes to realize that his bottom was burning. But that was not a big disadvantage because he knew how to behave, he was extremely polite, his manners were impeccable, and he revered the royal family.
For the majority of Diana's childhood, the Spencers were the Queen's nearest neighbours.
Diana had lived at Park House, which is next door to Sandringham, so she was part of that world.
Diana used to go and play at what they called the big house with Prince Andrew, who was almost the same age as her. And one of the nannies actually remembers seeing the Queen on her hands and knees playing hide and seek with Diana and Prince Andrew.
The Queen Mother and Lady Fermoy, Diana's maternal grandmother, plotted to see if they could get Charles to marry Diana.
The Spencers were perfect to become royal in-laws. They knew royal protocol, they were friends of the royal family, they were British aristocracy. On paper, they couldn't have been better.
But while the Spencers had all the right credentials to make this the perfect match, their characters were the polar opposite of the Windsors.
The Windsors kept everything to themselves. They wouldn't express their emotions, whereas the Spencers expressed it in volumes, catastrophically sometimes. They argued and fought and were quite dysfunctional.
Diana's parents, Johnny and Frances's marriage, was particularly volatile.
Johnny Spencer was always seen as a gentle sort of figure. That was his public image. But behind closed doors, he did have a temper on him, and Frances too was very forthright, and the two clashed.
This very early on damaged Diana as it would any child. No child wants to see their parents screaming at each other.
By the time Diana was 6 years old, her parents' marriage was over.
The divorce was one of bitterness and acrimony. The family was split. Diana's grandmother testified against her own daughter in favour of Earl Spencer. He won custody of the children, which was very unusual in those days. And Diana was deeply affected by it, to the point where she almost stopped speaking. And it's something which stayed with her all her life.
Then in 1976, Althorpe House gained a new, suitably extrovert resident, Diana's stepmother, Rain.
Rain was an absolute force of nature. She was a remarkable creature in many ways, famous for this sort of coiffed helmet of hair. She was a massive social climber. Her mother was a very colourful character. She was the Mills and Boon writer, Barbara Cartland, who really turned Rain into a sort of a project, really. Rain, she was determined, was to marry well. She set out not just to marry Johnny Spencer, but to marry a house. She really wanted to be chatelaine of Althorpe.
The latest member of the Spencer family did not receive a warm welcome from Diana and her siblings.
They used to hum the old nursery rhyme, "Rain, rain, go away, come back another day," very much in her hearing. Acid Rain was a later variant of Rain, Rain, Go Away. Acid Rain was very apt for Rain in many ways because she had a very sharp tongue on her. There were a lot of clashes between Rain and Johnny's children.
Diana had a fantasy of how she would escape the unhappiness of Spencer family life, inspired by her new step-grandmother, Barbara Cartland.
Diana, as a child, often had her head buried in these very romantic stories of the girl who's whisked off her feet by the handsome prince.
Now, aged 19, Diana's fairy tale ending was within reach. The loud and emotional Spencers and the discreet Windsors would soon be brought together for good. By February 1981, after just 13 dates, Prince Charles was ready to pop the question to the eminently suitable Lady Diana Spencer.
Charles invited her down to Windsor Castle, and they were in the nursery. And he just asked her, you know, would you like to marry me? And she said, oh, yes, please. It was just the ultimate dream for her.
The beginning of a day to remember for Prince Charles, Lady Diana, and for quite a lot of other people too. The long-awaited, much written about engagement had happened.
Diana had aristocratic blood, so when they became engaged, the Queen said, oh, she's one of us.
The Spencers were respected aristocrats, but this royal union would propel the family to global fame.
Johnny was taking one picture after another. It was very sweet.
Very happy for Diana, very happy.
Diana's
Diana's lovely.
beautiful. She looks beautiful.
Diana's lovely, very, very happy. Never seen her look better.
I think that a lot of people were suggesting that he'd enjoyed a drink or two, but of course he'd had a stroke in 1978, which had impacted upon the way he spoke.
It was the ultimate recognition of the aristocracy and the amazing family the Spencers were, that the heir to the throne would want to marry his daughter.
For Diana's stepmother, Rain, this was the moment in the spotlight that she had been waiting for.
Rain wanted to make herself known and so wore a white mink coat so the cameras could focus on her straight away.
She was now irretrievably linked to the royal family. She certainly had arrived. People wanted to hear not just from the Queen and the royal family, but from the Spencers.
Lady Spencer, what are they going to do now? What are their plans now? When are they going to get married, and where will they go and have their honeymoon, and where will they live?
Well, I think so much has got to be decided. You know, there's so many imponderables. The weddings, I think, has been announced will be in July, but no date has yet been fixed. For the obvious reasons, there's so many people's engagement books to rearrange.
While Diana's father was over the moon his daughter would be a royal bride, her mother Frances was wary. 12 years on from her acrimonious divorce from Diana's father, it felt like history was repeating itself.
Frances, Diana's mother, was terrified that her daughter was going to make the same mistake that she had made. She, Frances, had married very young. She was only 18 when she married Johnny Spencer. There was a big age gap, about 12 years. Isn't that familiar? The same as that between Charles and Diana.
Diana's mother's concern was about to be proved well-founded. Following the official announcement of their engagement, Charles and Diana spoke to the press together for the first time. It would become one of the most prophetic interviews in history.
I'm amazed that she's been brave enough to take me on.
And I suppose in love.
Of course. From Diana's point of view, it's very straightforward. We're going to get married. Why are you asking me if we're in love? Of course we are.
But then Charles gave his answer.
Whatever in love means.
He was baffled as to how to answer a question that was about his emotions. Don't forget, he'd been brought up by the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh to hide what they felt.
Normally, the clip cuts when he says whatever in love means.
But in this recently unearthed extended clip, you can see the full force of Diana's reaction.
Whatever in love means.
Well, it obviously
put your own
means,
interpretation.
obviously means two very happy people.
Yes.
Once again, congratulations.
Well, from us, congratulations.
Thank you very
much. Very kind.
God, it's incredible looking at that now. I haven't seen that before.
The expression on her face is so eloquent. I've never seen her show so clearly her dissatisfaction with him on camera before. It's a most remarkable piece of footage.
The silence between the two of them hangs terribly heavily.
Diana realised she couldn't be a Spencer and show what she felt. She had to be a Windsor and keep it all under wraps.
You can actually see the light go out behind her eyes. She felt almost her world collapse.
Now the Prince of Wales's fiancée, the royal family felt Diana needed their protection from the press. And so for her last few months as Lady Spencer, Diana stayed at Buckingham Palace. It was the perfect opportunity for the Spencer, who was soon to be a Windsor, to get to know her future in-laws.
Diana has talked about being traumatised by her own parents' divorce. She saw getting married and belonging to the Windsor family as an opportunity for her to create a stable, loving, secure family for herself.
Moving into Buckingham Palace would have been quite a shock to the system. Prince Andrew was away in the Navy, Prince Edward was away at school, the Queen and Prince Philip, of course, were in residence, but royals don't just drop in on each other.
Diana complained about her life at Buckingham Palace as being very lonely. She felt isolated. Diana had serious cold feet. She said to her sisters that she was going to call the wedding off. And the sisters said, "Too late, Dutch," which is their nickname for Diana. "Your face is on the tea towels now, so you can't chicken out."
While the world got ready for the wedding of the century, the fractured Spencer family became a national talking point.
One of the issues was over whether Barbara Cartland, she was the mother of Diana's stepmother, would receive an invitation.
In the end, Diana's step-grandmother watched the wedding at home, along with 750 million others around the world.
It really is a lovely Cinderella story, isn't it? You know, it's exactly Barbara Cartland's story. It couldn't be better.
Just I can say a word. May I say a word?
Please do.
Yes. The Spencers have, through the centuries, fought for their king and country. Today, Diana is vying to help her country for the rest of her life. She will be following in the tradition of her ancestors, and she will have at her side the man she loves.
He was identifying the Spencers and the royals and saying that to bring them together, to unify them, was an act of patriotism.
Are you at all apprehensive about today?
Not in the least. I'm looking forward to every moment of it.
Johnny Spencer could barely contain himself on Diana's wedding day. As Diana said to me, he was waving himself stupid. He loved it.
There were two reasons why everyone was looking forward to the moment Diana emerged from that carriage. One, of course, was to see Diana in the wedding dress, and the other was to see how Johnny Spencer, her father, would cope with that walk up the aisle.
Earl Spencer's stroke greatly affected his mobility. Now, the steps at St Paul's Cathedral are precarious on a normal day. Once they'd navigated the stairs, Then it was about a 3.5-minute walk down the aisle.
It was a superhuman effort by Lord Spencer, and you can see the concentration on his face.
He said that Diana walked him down the aisle, and it was incredibly moving.
They get to the altar where Prince Charles is, and Johnny Spencer kind of sort of stays there.
I imagine for the poor television cameras, it must have been a nightmare. Here was one of the prime shots, and Lord Spencer was sort of blocking it.
Just over an hour later, Diana Spencer became a member of the royal family.
Prince and Princess of Wales.
The Spencers and the Windsors, two families so close throughout British history, were at last officially tied.
What a moment for any parents.
The happy couple headed off on honeymoon.
They spent a very great deal of their honeymoon at Balmoral. 6 weeks with your in-laws. I'm afraid it wasn't the best start to married life.
It wasn't long before the differences between the Spencers and Windsors began to reveal themselves.
Diana showed how unhappy she was. The Queen really had no time for what she regarded as a sort of self-indulgent, emotional stuff that Diana was pulling on the royals, and she said that Diana would have to buck up.
Then on the 21st of June 1982, the Spencer and Windsor families were irreversibly joined together forever. By royal proclamation, the birth of Prince William was announced.
For the Spencers, their blood is in the future King of England, so their place in history is assured.
Diana's mother Frances and her sister Jane rushed to the hospital, where they were the first of the extended family to see the new royal baby.
Minutes later, the other happy grandmother arrived, the Queen.
The Queen was delighted, as the whole family were. Allegedly, she said, well, at least he hasn't got ears like his father.
And then the final verdict from the Earl Spencer.
Good morning, sir. Can you tell us how you're...
Good morning.
How is she?
Very well indeed, thank you.
Johnny Spencer was absolutely exuberant.
Lovely baby, really super baby, you know? Not a little puckered-up face at all, a really good one. Hello, how are you?
He was, of course, now grandfather to a future king, and an aristocrat would understand exactly what that meant.
It's good news.
There was even better news in store for Diana's stepmother, Rain. The Queen was coming to Althorpe for tea.
Rain was a real perfectionist, and she wanted to make sure everything was done right. There was a full-blown dress rehearsal a day before. She had the whole outside of the house repainted. The visit was in November, and not best for painting and decorating, and the poor old painters, they had to use a sponge to sort of dry all the stonework before they could slop the paint on. It all turned out to be a complete waste of time because the Queen arrived after dark.
To Rain's relief, the meeting between the monarch and the Spencers at Althorpe ran smoothly.
It was a triumph for Rain because here she was, hosting the Queen, pouring the tea.
The Spencers and the Windsors' relationship seemed to be going from strength to strength. The House of Windsor and House of Spencer were forever linked with the birth of Prince William. When Prince Harry came along on the 15th of September 1984, the Spencer family blood was suddenly coursing through the veins of the second and third in line to the British throne.
Like any father, Prince Charles was keen to introduce his two sons to each other at the first opportunity. And so it was that Prince William was led by the hand back to the room where he was born 2 years ago.
Unlike his brother, Harry seemed to have inherited those striking Spencer looks, something Prince Charles clocked straight away.
He's alleged to have said, my goodness, you know, he's got red hair.
And that was clearly a remark aimed at the Spencer family. Their distinctive hair was already visible.
At the entrance to Kensington Palace, the Prince and Princess and their baby arrived from the hospital at speed and swept in without stopping. Then, less than an hour later, Prince Charles left to play polo, something most new fathers would hardly dare to suggest.
The news that he had more or less dumped Diana and Harry at Kensington Palace and hurried out to play polo seemed astonishing, but that was often the royal way.
This couldn't be further from the family life young Diana Spencer dreamed of when marrying her prince and joining the House of Windsor.
I think that Diana had completely different views of what being a Windsor wife was to her husband. To Charles, it was all about duty, it was about producing the heir and the spare, which she had done. I think she felt that perhaps her life was very much of secondary importance at this stage.
On December the 21st, 1984, the Spencer and Windsor families came together to celebrate Prince Harry's christening. In true Windsor style, any problems Charles and Diana were having were pushed to the side. It was all smiles for Harry's big day.
Look, I was christened in this. Looks remarkably well despite it.
But away from the cameras, there was a clash between the two sides of the family.
Charles made a comment to Diana's mother and said, "Oh, it's a shame Harry's not a girl."
Frances took this like a knife to her heart because she lost a baby boy. She was furious that someone could not be totally grateful for a baby who was healthy and vigorous.
So when she retorted, "You should be very happy, you've had a healthy boy," he was taken aback because Prince of Wales is not used to being spoken to like that.
It was an extraordinary outburst because most people are in fear and trepidation of very senior royals and don't want to get into an argument in company.
Confrontations like this were not the norm for the reserved Windsors. As Diana struggled to find her feet as a Windsor wife, the royal family hoped she could maintain a stiff upper lip. But as a Spencer, that did not come naturally.
Diana was very troubled at this stage of her marriage. She was deeply suspicious about Camilla Parker Bowles. She believed that Charles still loved Camilla, was probably seeing Camilla, and this forced her even further into her eating disorders, I think.
Diana would scream and shout and get hysterical and cry, and Charles absolutely had no idea how to deal with a person like that.
The Windsors found Diana's fiery Spencer temperament completely alien too.
I mean, the Queen Mother allegedly once said that the Spencers are very difficult. And Diana was proving that she was indeed quite troublesome to the royal family.
The young woman they remembered from the courting days who had charmed the royal family was a dim and distant memory.
The royal family don't do sick, and if you're cold, you put on a sweater. If you're sick, you take an aspirin. And Diana's moods, staying in her room, not coming down for breakfast, running out of the room during dinner, these were baffling aspects of behaviour as far as the Queen was concerned.
It wasn't long before the Queen had a Spencer knocking on her door for marriage advice.
I think Diana would have felt it was quite normal to go to your mother-in-law and say, look, things aren't working out. Oh, you know, what should I do with your boy, with Charles? How shall I treat him? And the Queen just replied, I don't know. And as Diana then said, what sort of help was that?
The Queen was a bit of an imperial ostrich who didn't want to be burdened with Diana's emotional baggage.
I wonder whether she would have felt trapped inside, you know, the palace walls. Here I am on my own. I don't feel that there's anyone I can particularly turn to.
Both families encouraged Charles and Diana to keep up appearances throughout the 80s.
The Spencers and the Windsors were united in trying to keep the Wales' marriage together. There was very much a sense on all sides that the marriage of the heir to the throne could not fail.
But eventually the cracks started to show.
All the press attention was focused on the couple's attitude to each other as the gloomy winter evening closed in. Rumours of marriage problems put their relationship under intense public scrutiny.
I think it must have been horrific for Diana, actually, to continue this public persona when inside she was falling apart and her marriage was crumbling.
By the early 90s, the union that joined the two families was publicly falling apart. It was a difficult period for the Windsors, with two other royal marriages in trouble. An unhappy Diana turned to her own family more and more. But the Spencers also had a terrible year.
I mean, 1992 really was bookended by sadness and tragedy. The death of Diana's beloved father in March that year. That was a huge blow for Diana, and in many ways it may have precipitated the things that were to come down the line.
Diana was really hit for six, and it also coincided with the kind of epoch of the War of the Waleses. She got little support from Charles.
Her wreath said, "I miss you dreadfully, darling Daddy, but will love you forever, Diana."
I think she relies on Sarah, Jane and Charles, her three siblings, as you would at a parent's funeral.
Then, just 3 months later, the release of Andrew Morton's now infamous book rocked the royal family.
For a year and a half, Diana and I worked together on her biography, Diana, Her True Story. And when it was published in June 1992, people were saying, well, was Diana behind it, or what's going on here?
This would have sent shockwaves through the royal family, because what this book was doing was opening up the family secrets.
The tour of South Korea was really the last hurrah, I suppose. It was a picture of unhappiness, of marital turmoil.
On the 9th of December 1992, the inevitable announcement was made by Prime Minister John Major.
It is announced from Buckingham Palace that, with regret, the Prince and Princess of Wales have decided to separate.
Within days, the Spencer family took sides.
As the marriage completely unravelled and the awful years that followed, they were immensely loyal to Diana.
When Diana separated from Prince Charles, she came to rely a lot more on her big sister, Sarah.
Sarah becomes a sort of de facto lady-in-waiting, and she trusts Sarah to be at her right-hand side when she's on official visits abroad. She feels very safe with Sarah.
On the 28th of February 1996, Diana agreed to a divorce. The 15-year relationship between the Spencers and the Windsors was all but over.
One of the rare occasions when the Queen intervened, because she does try to stay out of the private affairs of her family, but this time she wrote to Charles and she wrote to Diana and she said, get a divorce.
She's said to be inside Kensington Palace, very sad and very pensive, according to friends.
A royal divorce for the second in line to the throne. This is monumental. You know, this is the breaking up of the fairy tale marriage that they had delivered to the nation.
In many ways, there was a sense of relief from the Windsors that the divorce had come about. For Diana's siblings, there was a relief too, because they had sort of been drawn into the vortex of the Diana-Charles saga for so many years. I think everyone was worried about how she was going to cope in this sort of post-divorce world. You know, she'd been stripped of her royal title. What was she going to do? She had to find a new role for herself.
And as the families began to slip apart, Diana embraced her freedom from the Windsors. No one could have predicted the tragedy that would force them back together. By the summer of 1997, both the Spencer and Windsor families faced the fallout of Diana's newfound freedom.
The Spencers and the Windsors were horrified. There was Diana going out with an Egyptian playboy. She was off the rails as far as they were concerned at this time. Diana's own mother was absolutely furious.
She wasn't, in fact, on speaking terms with her mother at all.
But one person stepped forward to listen in the unlikely form of an old family foe, Johnny Spencer's widow, Rain.
Diana was full of surprises throughout her life, and there were few surprises to compete with her decision to change Rain Spencer from being the hated, wicked stepmother to becoming a close confidant. Rain was an outsider. Diana considered herself an outsider, and she found great comfort and consolation in Rain. Rain was appointed to one of Harrod's boards by Muhammad al-Fayed, and that cemented really the connection between Diana's Spencer family, if you like, with Muhammad al-Fayed.
At the end of August 1997, Dodi Fayed took Diana to Paris. The events that followed pushed the already strained relationship between the Spencers and the Windsors to breaking point.
The Mercedes in which the princess had been travelling with Dodi Fayed.
The driver lost control. The car span, overturned and hit a pillar.
News leaked out slowly to the Spencer family, and it wasn't clear whether Diana was alive or dead.
Diana's mother was sitting at home in Scotland waiting. She gets one phone call, Diana's been injured, doesn't get another word. It was a terrible ordeal for the whole family to go through. Just this gradual seeping under the door of information.
At 4 a.m., Diana was officially pronounced dead. The British ambassador phoned Balmoral to tell the royal family the news.
As far as Prince Charles was concerned, when he heard the news at first, he was absolutely horrified, and he said everybody was going to blame him. But more than that, feeling this was going to have a disastrous effect on the monarchy itself.
Prince Charles had made a decision, against the Queen's wishes, to go to Paris with Diana's sisters, Sarah and Jane, to bring Diana home.
Charles fought for Diana more strongly after her death than he had done in her life. It was a strange irony.
Thrown together in grief, the Spencers and the Windsors had less than a week to make arrangements.
There was quite a tussle between the Spencers and the Windsors as to what kind of funeral they wanted. Is she a member of the royal family? Is she a member of the Spencer clan? Is she royal? She's no longer HRH. She's divorced. I mean, who is she?
There was a huge falling out, certainly between Charles Spencer and the Prince of Wales, and they had a big verbal altercation on the telephone. So much so, the Prince of Wales ended up hanging the phone up on Charles Spencer.
Charles Spencer was too Spencer-like and Prince Charles was too Windsor-like, so they never connected.
The planning for the funeral was extremely fraught, but it was largely kept in the hands of the palace.
After one of the most astonishing weeks in British history, the funeral was a chance for both families to put their differences aside and grieve together. It was attended by 1 million mourners in London and billions more around the world.
There was a sharp intake of breath at seeing these terribly young boys looking up at the carriage that carried their mother's coffin.
Royal tradition is that the male members of the family do accompany the funeral cortege.
Prince Harry told me, looking back, it was absolutely terrible that they would do this for a 12-year-old boy. This is, of course, a Windsor decision, not a Spencer one, to make him walk behind his mother's coffin.
The division between the Spencer and Windsor families was there for all to see. It fell to Charles Spencer to deliver the funeral address.
I stand before you today, the representative of a family in grief, in a country in mourning, before a world in shock.
Earl Spencer's eulogy was one of the most astonishing speeches of the 20th century.
On behalf of your mother and sisters, I pledge that we, your blood family, will do all we can to continue the imaginative and loving way in which you are steering these two exceptional young men, so that their souls are not simply immersed by duty and tradition, but can sing openly as you planned.
It was devastating in its assault on the royal family, in the sense that it was suggested that the boys had been constricted by these old-fashioned fuddy-duddy traditions.
I was reporting it sort of opposite the Abbey, and when we heard that eulogy, I thought, oh my goodness, he's actually damning the royal family.
And the Queen is his godmother. That's how closely bound the Windsors and the Spencers are. And I think it was extremely courageous of the Earl to make his feelings so pointedly known.
This was a rapier thrust from her own godson, and I think the Queen was quite shaken by it, actually.
It was possibly the most audacious eulogy in front of the Queen for hundreds of years by a member of the aristocracy. Critical of the monarch to her face, critical of the royal family to their faces.
It was an extraordinary kind of act of rebellion.
After this scathing attack, could the Spencers' relationship with the Windsors ever recover?
The death of Diana was the death of the very long-term relationship between the Windsors and the Spencers. There was such bad feeling.
The relationship between the two families was very much broken for a long time.
After the funeral, Diana was taken back to the Spencer family estate at Althorpe to be buried.
Charles Spencer, said, she's a Spencer, she's come back home.
On the way to Althorpe, the Queen's private secretary offered to reinstate Diana's HRH title in an attempt to reconcile their differences.
Sir Robert Fellows did offer to reinstate that title, Her Royal Highness, for Diana, but Charles Spencer refused that offer.
The Spencer and the Windsor families will always be linked by William and Harry.
The Spencers have been more closely involved with Harry and William than we know about. They do it quietly behind the scenes. There is a very close relationship between the boys and their aunts and uncle.
In 2004, the Diana Memorial Fountain was unveiled in Hyde Park. The Spencers and the Windsors were there en masse for the first time since Diana's funeral. The event was a chance for the two families to rebuild their troubled relationship.
Of course, there were difficult times, but memories mellow with the passing of the years.
It was a sort of truce between the two families that let's move on. We will try to repair the damage as much as we can.
The relationship between the Windsors and the Spencers has been strained over the years, but both families are now invested together in the British monarchy.
Both families have put the past behind them. They did have to bury the hatchet because William is the future king. He is part Spencer and part Windsor.
The Spencers and the Windsors have been, at times, the clash of the titans. They've been two families with a deep relationship, and without the Spencers, the Windsors wouldn't be the family they are today.
It's a significant moment when your family marries into a new circle. But becoming part of the House of Windsor is an altogether different matter.
It must be an overwhelming sensation to know that you and your child are going to be forever associated with royalty.
What is it like to suddenly find your family intimately within the royal orbit? Is it a dream?
It was a total shock when it came.
Or a royal nightmare?
And I suppose in love. Whatever in love means.
Outsiders have struggled to do well when they enter the royal family.
Do you ever have disagreements about things?
Oh, yes.
When Fergie met the monarchy, it elevated her family to royalty.
For Ron Ferguson, to have your daughter marry a prince, become a duchess, and to become a senior member of the royal family, I mean, it just doesn't get any better.
But two families coming together brings with it palace politics.
You're not only marrying royal in-laws, but also all of the people working at the palace, and you have to be pretty sophisticated in order to maneuver yourself throughout.
Royal insiders reveal what was said behind closed doors.
Charles apparently said, look, the problem with Sarah is you just can't shut her up.
And when the Fergusons brought scandal to the House of Windsor,
Ronald Ferguson was photographed entering a club for men, and it offered massage. And the rumour got around that the massage wasn't quite all they offered.
we discover what happened to the royals' new relatives.
Senior royals did rue the day that they had ever invited the Ferguson family to join them.
And if there is any way back.
What it meant for Fergie was expulsion from the royal family, and she was on her own again.
The love affair between Fergie and the monarchy began in the summer of 1985 at Ascot. As the royals prepared to return for dinner at Windsor Castle, an unsuspecting Prince Andrew was about to be set up on a date.
Prince Andrew was in the Navy, he was still a bachelor, and I think that the royal family were quite keen for him to settle down. Diana said to the Queen, you know, I think it would be lovely if we could invite Fergie. She's a friend of mine, she's about the same age as Andrew.
Both were good time gals and boys, and the scene was set at Windsor Castle with a lot of booze.
They sat next to each other and they were flirting almost from the, you know, from the word go.
Andrew rather cheekily insisted that she take a great big plate of profiterole rolls and said, don't worry, I'll have some too, and then didn't. So I think she gave him a sort of playful slap, and I think that was really the beginning of their relationship.
It was the start of a romance that would spark intense public interest in Fergie's family.
She came from a very well-to-do family. Sarah's mother, Susan, married Ronald Ferguson when she was only 18 years old, and they had two children, Sarah, who's called Fergie, and her sister Jane. And they bought this beautiful house called Lowood, very near Ascot, in that very beautiful area full of rhododendrons and trees and houses hidden behind big gates. And that's where Fergie grew up.
They always were aspirational. I think they had a feeling they were sort of almost minor aristocracy. For Sarah, in the back of her mind, she was always going to try to get a husband who was special and certainly rich.
Even for the well-to-do Fergusons, Fergie's relationship with Andrew was a tantalising prospect.
Ronald Ferguson was absolutely thrilled and delighted. 10 out of 10 for him. She couldn't have done better. Marrying into the royal family has to change things, doesn't it? Because it's that final bit of icing on the cake.
But there are hurdles to clear for a royal bride-to-be, not least a stern examination of the family tree. Thankfully, when it came to the Fergusons, the Windsors didn't have to look too far from their own.
Some people like to say that Sarah Ferguson was middle class. She wasn't.
No, oh, my God, to be thought of as a commoner, my goodness, no, they were very much upper-class English.
The Ferguson family actually can trace their lineage back to the royal family. So Sarah Ferguson and Prince Andrew are very, very distantly related through Charles II, but not that that is much of a cause for concern for the royal family. In fact, they probably encourage that.
It wasn't just shared distant relations that tied the Fergusons to the Windsors, but also their social circles.
Ron Ferguson, Fergie's father, had mixed with members of the royal family for many years. He'd been in a very smart cavalry regiment. He'd ridden alongside the Queen on the Mall. He'd played polo with Prince Philip. And of course, he managed the polo lifestyle of the Prince of Wales. So they were a family that the Windsors were familiar with.
But Fergie's well-connected background hid a childhood trauma. By the age of 13, her parents, Ronald and Susan, had separated.
Sarah was at a pivotal age. I mean, those early teenage years, it can really mess with your head when things at home aren't the way you want them to be and aren't the way you expect them to be.
She had this magical childhood, and then suddenly it all sort of folded. She talks about it herself, how that's when she started to feel very insecure and inadequate, and she blamed herself for the breakup of her parents' marriage.
In 1975, Sarah's mother Susan left the UK to start a new life with a new man in Argentina, leaving Sarah and her older sister Jane to be brought up by their father. As Sarah grew into adulthood, Ron Ferguson's influence on her would be profound.
After Sarah's mother ran off to Argentina, she became quite a daddy's girl. I think she got a lot of strength from having her father solidly behind her, and he was very good with her.
With Ron Ferguson's sense of determination running through her, Fergie's pursuit of happiness had now led her to her dashing prince. As their courtship blossomed, it was soon time for Andrew to take the relationship to the next daunting level.
Sarah was invited to Sandringham for a shooting weekend because the Queen always believed that, that the only way that her children are going to ever get to know anyone is to entertain them in one of the royal homes.
Well, I think for Sarah to meet the Windsors is a hugely pressurizing point in her early relationship with Andrew, because here you are, you're the outsider coming in. You know that everybody's gaze is on you.
Her own mother and father had been to Sandringham for shooting weekends, and obviously they had told her what to do. So she was not completely ignorant of how it was going to work, but she was very nervous.
So I think she found herself in that situation feeling, I don't know if they're going to like me, I also want them to absolutely adore me, and all that at once can be a pressure cooker situation for things to go monumentally wrong. And I think in Sarah's case, they kind of did.
When she walked into the double sitting room at Sandringham, I think she tripped over one of the Queen's corgis and she spilt her drink. And then in her fluster, she just thought, who are all these people? So she just curtsied to everyone because she knew that that way she wasn't making a faux pas.
After that, I wonder whether, from Sarah's point of view, what she wanted to do was redouble her efforts to really please them and be the perfect person in their eyes.
Despite less than royal first impressions, Fergie set about winning over the Windsors by appealing to their interests.
She was someone who really threw herself into the pursuits that the royal family value. For example, she learned to drive four in hand, you know, carriage driving, the thing that Prince Philip at that time absolutely loved, and she was pretty good at it. And Philip thought this was extraordinary.
She had learned to ride at a very young age, and Her Majesty loves horses, and she liked to ride, and the fact that Sarah could accompany her on horseback was another huge plus.
After finding common ground, Fergie's outgoing nature began to charm the Windsors.
I think with the royal family, when they're in their personal time, it is a very outdoorsy kind of life that they lead, hunting, shooting, fishing, and she was up for all of that. So her larger-than-life, boisterous, up-for-anything personality very much endeared her to them.
So, you know, the stars were really aligning very quickly for Andrew and Fergie because she had made such a big impression on his family.
Sarah had passed the sternest of royal tests. Her family were up to scratch. By February 1986, Sarah Ferguson had been dating Prince Andrew for less than a year. After a whirlwind romance and winning over the royals at Sandringham, Fergie was whisked away to Scotland, where Andy had an important question to ask her.
Fergie and Andrew went to spend the weekend with the Duke of Roxburgh at Flores Castle. well, as you do if you're a prince. And during that time and that romantic setting, he went down on one knee and he asked her to marry him. And I think she was so surprised. I mean, she just burst out laughing.
She thought, was this all some big joke? You know, because felt she was so un-princess-like. She wasn't this perfect-looking girl, and she just couldn't believe it could quite happen to her.
She said, of course, of course. She was just over the moon.
The Fergusons, when they realised that their daughter was engaged to Prince Andrew, I mean, they were, you know, they were ecstatic. They thought this was the most marvellous thing.
How do you feel this morning, Regan? How do you expect me to feel?
Excited.
I feel absolutely thrilled.
On the 17th of March 1986, the announcement that Ron Ferguson had been waiting for finally came. Sarah Ferguson and Prince Andrew were to be married.
Do you remember what he said?
Absolutely. But I'm not telling you.
It was the epitome of the social ambitions of Ron Ferguson to have his daughter marrying the Queen's favourite and second son. I mean, it put them front and centre of British public life.
He went from being, you know, a landowner to being a member of the House of Windsor. And he referred to himself as being a member of the royal family. So, you know, the Fergusons had arrived.
Thousands of miles away in Argentina, Fergie's mother Susan was a little more restrained than her former husband in reacting to her daughter's impending nuptials.
How do you feel today?
Very happy, very pleased.
Do you think that something might change in your life from today onwards?
No, I don't see any change.
Because she went to live in South America, I think that Susan, Sarah's mother, didn't feel that the marriage would change things for her. But it's a curious thing, she was very wary.
After months of planning, on the 23rd of July 1986, the big day arrived. With her father by her side, all eyes were on Fergie as she prepared to become the Duchess of York.
Fergie herself, you know, she was very nervous, but she had her father at her side in the coach going to Westminster Abbey, and he just made her laugh and told her jokes all the way there.
It was huge. You know, Andrew was fourth in line to the throne. He was the favoured son. And so, you know, this had to go really, really well.
The focus was also on the Windsors and how they would accommodate Fergie's fractured family.
The etiquette can be quite tricky when you've got extended families, broken families. I mean, by this stage, both Sarah's mother and father had remarried. She had half-sisters, half-brothers. Were they all going to be invited? Was it okay? You know, is divorce still a dirty word in the royal family?
The other thing to remember is the fact that Fergie's mother had married an Argentinian. That was obviously a discussion at the time. It wasn't that many years since Britain had been at war with Argentina over the Falkland Islands. So there are all these sort of minor diplomatic niggles in the background which could affect, if you like, sort of the long-term integration of these families going forward.
But things have moved on by this time, in 1986, and both her mother's partner, Hector, and Ronald's new wife, also called Susan, were invited. And in fact, actually, her half-brother and half-sister from her father's new marriage, they acted as page boy and bridesmaids. So it was very inclusive.
It was very forward-thinking of the royal family to embrace them at that stage, because it was relatively new at the time in the UK, where you started having these, you know, more complicated family structures, and very much in their interest to bring them in, because ultimately they also become, in a way, ambassadors in terms of the royal brand.
With the Ferguson family warmly welcomed, Fergie relished the day that she finally became a royal.
I remember her saying to me, you know, the little girl that used to play tag with Andrew was now marrying her prince. And he was her prince. She truly loved the man, and she couldn't quite believe it.
You couldn't take that smile off her face. It was almost a sort of, yeah, I've done it. You know, here I am, right up here marrying the Queen's son in full view of everybody. I think there was a sense of triumph about her in many ways, but also a sense that it's unbelievable, isn't it? It's me, it's just me, Fergie.
The day was just as exhilarating for Ron Ferguson as it was for his daughter.
Major Ron had been up half the night, walking up and down the Mall, because everyone was partying there, and he just wanted to drink in the atmosphere.
He was licking his lips at one point. He was very much focus of attention, as well as Sarah, and his whole family were the focus of world attention. And it was like, this is the stamp, this is the seal of approval for the Fergusons.
He'd been part of royal circles for a long time, but to have your daughter marry a prince, become a duchess, with all the grand ceremonial at Westminster Abbey, and to be included in the royal family, become a senior member of the royal family. I mean, it just doesn't get any better.
The union of the Fergusons and the monarchy was now complete. All that was left to seal a perfect day was for the royal couple to make the traditional balcony appearance in front of thousands of well-wishers.
At the end of the wedding, that afternoon, there was just a hint that all might not be well, because they did a very strange thing. They did this odd business of kind of working the crowd up, almost like they were a sort of music hall entertainers. You know, the crowd were chanting kiss, 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 and Sarah was sort of conducting and orchestrating this.
Well, I think there's a fine line between sort of exuberance and sort of being over the top. And Fergie strayed too often into the over-the-top realms. She somehow just didn't know when to sort of throttle back.
The senior royals standing alongside, there was an uncomfortable feeling about that. Again, the word is, it was slightly vulgar. So, although the wedding itself was good, there was a hint of trouble to come.
Sarah Ferguson, the horsey girl from Hampshire, was now Her Royal Highness, the Duchess of York. She had brought the Ferguson family name into the royal spotlight, and from the outside, she seemed to be settling well into royal life. But among her royal in-laws, not everyone was a fan.
Anne was probably the only senior royal who, right from the start, was very wary of Sarah. I mean, she called her the outsider. What had at first seemed, especially to Charles, to Philip, this bright, positive young thing coming in and sort of adding sparkle, was just starting to sort of leak away. Charles apparently said, look, the problem with Sarah is you just can't shut her up. She could be fun some of the time, but just not all the time, because it was giving them a headache.
The Queen was the one person who, you know, remained steadfastly loyal and absolutely loved being in the company of her daughter-in-law, far more than she liked being with Diana. Fergie loved dogs, Fergie could ride, Fergie could do everything that Diana couldn't do.
Sarah's husband, Prince Andrew, returned to sea, and Fergie had to leave her old life as a Ferguson and navigate the new world of the Windsors by herself.
She said she married the man, but ended up in a marriage with the palace.
She had to act in a certain manner. That wasn't Sarah. Sarah was this huge, bubbly personality. People think that living in a palace, wow, how glorious being this princess. It actually wasn't. It was the reverse. It was very bleak, it was very lonely, and there was no escape from it.
Despite Fergie's problems within the palace, her place within the Windsor family was strengthened when she gave birth to Princess Beatrice.
Ferguson blood is now part of the royal lineage. It kind of cements that relationship between the in-laws, in this case the Fergusons, and the royals.
2 years later, another baby, Princess Eugenie, joined the York family and became sixth in line to the throne.
Oyez! 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 Her Royal Highness, the Duchess of York, is safe delivered of a daughter at 7:58 p.m. today. Her Royal Highness and child are well.
Sarah had given the Windsors their first royal princesses since Princess Anne's birth. Her most significant champion, the Queen, even came to visit the Duchess in hospital. But despite the monarch's support, Sarah seemed to be losing allies within the royal circle. Even the British press, who had once welcomed her with open arms, began to criticise her behaviour.
Fergie and Andrew first went to America. They were in Los Angeles, and I was there. I was part of the press crew there. I would just remember they were at this very big conference, and Andrew was giving a speech, and then Fergie got up and gave a little speech.
Sarah, and I know against advice, wanted to make a speech, which, you know, the wives of royals wouldn't normally do. It's breaking with protocol, but she insisted.
At last, I have the turn to talk. All these men around here.
Love you.
I'll see you later.
That phrase, it was only a joke, but it had a sort of sexual connotation, which is a complete no-no.
The worm had turned somewhat by then, and Fergie was not enjoying the same sort of flattering headlines that she'd had up until, you know, in the early years of the marriage. It was Ron, her father, who stood up for her.
Although the tide was beginning to turn against the Duchess, it was ironically her father, Major Ferguson, who first brought disgrace into Sarah's new life as a Windsor.
Well, in 1988, there was a huge scandal about Ronald Ferguson being photographed entering a club called the Wigmore Club. Now, the Wigmore Club was a club for men, and it offered massage. And the rumour got around that the massage wasn't quite all they offered.
It was deeply embarrassing for Ron Ferguson because he was enjoying the sort of reflected glory of being associated with the Windsors, and then all of a sudden he had his antics just splashed all over the front cover of all the tabloids, and of course must have deeply embarrassed his daughter.
The fallout from this scandal of the Wigmore Club was enormous, because at the time Ronald ran the Guards Polo Club, and he had a very responsible job, but this scandal really besmirched his name.
He issued a statement to clarify reports in this morning's newspapers. In it, Major Ferguson said, "I have not been sacked and I have not resigned, but I was not re-elected and was not prepared to accept the alternative position."
Prince Philip, who was president of the club, refused to help.
He kept asking to meet Philip and his daughter's father-in-law, and Philip refused because of the associated kind of taint. And it's just, you become basically persona non grata. And unfortunately, you know, look, families, we all fall out, we have tiffs and things like that, but when you have a fall from grace like that within the royal family, it takes a very, very long time to be accepted back in, and in some cases, never.
Fergie becomes guilty by association. This is your father, this is what he's done, and she almost has to mop up after that particular scandal and redouble her efforts once again to get into the royal family's good grace.
Sarah's loyalty to her own family was tested by her father's scandal. With her new husband, Prince Andrew, often at sea, her loyalty to the Windsors was now also tested.
Fergie was a very needy woman. She needed her man there, she needed him beside her, and often when Andrew came back from these long stints, his main preoccupation was either golf or watching television because he was simply too tired to do anything else. And the marriage began to unravel.
Sarah's friendships with other men began to be scrutinized, particularly when she became close with American businessman Steve Wyatt. Fergie's new friendship was revealed in the newspapers when a cleaner found photos of them on holiday, and the press began to ask questions about the Yorks' marriage.
The stories claim that the Duchess travelled to Morocco with Mr. Wyatt and met for other holidays, parties and private dinners. A cleaner at Mr. Wyatt's former flat is said to have found photographs of the couple together.
It wasn't an obvious example of definite proof of infidelity, but, you know, it was pretty close.
Separation was a huge step forward, and one which the Queen must have been deeply saddened about. That they clearly needed a break from each other because things were not happy. But I think the Queen was as baffled as the rest of us as to why it had come to this.
Sarah had to decide to either make the marriage work or move on. And in March, the Duke and Duchess announced their separation.
The Yorks' apparent separation leaves two young children in an unprecedented position so close to the throne, and a young woman whose role and future as a divorced Duchess of York will take the royal family into uncharted waters.
After the separation was announced, all Sarah's formal appointments, all the events that she was booked for, they were all cancelled.
Fergie's royal life stopped.
Once you've stepped across a certain line, you're cast into outer darkness, and that's what happened to Sarah.
The press speculated that Fergie could re-enter the Windsor fold by somehow repairing the marriage. But then rumours began to circulate of a new man in her life, John Bryan.
Fergie was in a very distraught state, so her friend of the moment, who was her financial advisor, supposedly, John Bryan, decided, let's get away from it all. I'll rent a villa in the south of France, and Fergie and I will go there with the children and the nanny, and we'll just have a break. But unfortunately for them, the photographers found them immediately.
Unknown to Fergie and John Bryan, they had been caught by the paparazzi. Sarah later flew to Balmoral to stay with the royal family on their annual summer break.
The morning's newspapers are all laid out on a side table in the breakfast room in Balmoral, and that morning's newspapers were filled with pictures of Sarah Ferguson.
She was caught lying in the sun with this guy apparently sucking her toes. I mean, he claims, as if it makes any difference, he was kissing her toes. Anyway, unbeknown to Sarah, the newspapers had got photos. Paparazzi had taken these pictures, the newspapers got them.
These are the pictures that the Queen and her son, the Duke of York, will have seen at the breakfast table at Balmoral this morning. An intimate series of photos showing her daughter-in-law and his wife topless at the poolside in the south of France, kissing a Texan millionaire. The Queen's granddaughters, 5th and 6th in line to the throne, are pictured standing by watching.
I mean, it's impossible to imagine the shock, the horror, even for someone as self-confident as Sarah, when she saw these pictures. And apparently Prince Philip came into the breakfast room, picked up one of the papers and just threw it in front of her and walked out.
Fergie had shamed the Ferguson and Windsor names and left Balmoral soon after.
The Duchess of York left Balmoral Castle today using a side entrance of the royal estate to drive to Aberdeen Airport. Her two daughters, Princess Eugenie and Princess Beatrice, were with her. No longer the luxury or privilege of an aircraft of the Queen's flight, for the Duchess just an ordinary scheduled flight to Heathrow.
Fergie was out of the royal family, and divorce proceedings began between her and Prince Andrew. But as the mother of the 5th and 6th in line to the throne, she still had to navigate the world of the Windsors.
Well, basically, after the breakup of the marriage, the family ignores Fergie. Prince Philip is absolutely incandescent with rage with her because he feels that she's let down the monarchy, which he has spent his entire life supporting, i.e. his wife, the Queen. And in a few years, Fergie had reduced the reputation of the monarchy to shreds in his mind, and he was absolutely not going to put up with it. And he said to the Queen, she is not coming here. She's out. I don't ever want to see her again.
Sarah and Andrew officially divorced in May 1996. Fergie could retain the name Duchess of York, but was stripped of her Royal Highness title. Any support she could take from the Ferguson clan also began to slip away.
In 1998, Sarah loses her mother, who dies in an accident, and in 2003, she loses her father, and her only sister lives in Australia. So we once again find her in that space where she's isolated, lonely, and cut off, and grieving.
The closest family she had left in the UK were her daughters and her ex-husband, Prince Andrew.
Sarah had very publicly cuckolded Andrew, and yet Andrew is very forgiving of her. He continues to be there for her. He helps her financially. Prince Andrew inherits a royal lodge, the Queen Mother's home in Windsor Great Park. He does it up at great expense, and Fergie pretty much moves in with him and continues to live there. It was baffling to the royal family, particularly to Prince Philip, who could not understand why she was still occupying a royal home.
And they were very, very determined to make this one of the happiest divorces you could do. And that's what they did.
As Fergie's turbulent history with the Windsors faded, she was slowly and quietly admitted to the fringes of royal life. But in 2010, she was in debt and made a reckless decision revealed in an explosive undercover exposé. Undercover reporter Mazia Mahmood, dubbed the fake sheikh, had posed as a businessman and lured Sarah into a financial sting. At the time, Andrew was the UK's trade envoy. Although there was no suggestion of any wrongdoing by the prince, for Fergie, it looked even worse than the toe-sucking pictures with John Bryan that had effectively expelled her from the royal family.
It was considered to be particularly damaging because it was selling the royal brand for the highest bidder. And when that news story came out, it did damage the brand of the Windsors because all of a sudden, everybody around the world felt, well, actually, if you want to go and have tea or coffee or a meeting, you just, show them the money.
I don't think the royal family could envisage a worse betrayal than someone selling access to them.
Well, I think probably the senior royals did rue the day that they had ever invited the Ferguson family to join them.
The fake sheikh business was one of the low points in Fergie's life.
It looked like Fergie had really gone too far this time and had burnt her bridges with the Windsors for good. In the face of scandals, affairs and divorce, could there ever be a way back into royal life? There were only two things that joined the Windsor and the Ferguson families together indefinitely. Their names were Beatrice and Eugenie.
The children are the glue between the Fergusons and the House of Windsor, and that glue is unbreakable.
Having grown up in the shadow of their parents, as young women they found themselves torn between the Windsors and Fergie.
Beatrice and Eugenie, by this time, are adults. They're very conscious of their position within the royal family. But they also have this relationship with their mother, who is such a pivotal part of their lives.
I'm here for you, Bob.
Yeah, thanks, Mum. I see myself as a mini mummy. So I kind of have this sort of image that anything you could do, I want to do better. So I want to...
I have to tell you, that's easy.
It's almost a sort of split world. The wild side of them can come out when they're with Sarah, and it certainly does. And then the restrained side, they perform for the royal family. The Queen loved Eugenie and Beatrice.
They've done terribly well, considering the hot water that their grandfather and their mother and father have got themselves into.
This tug-of-war for the princesses reared its head in the most public of settings. In 2011, the royal family came together to celebrate the wedding of Prince William and Kate Middleton.
Royal weddings are a chance for us to have a window, a peep into the Windsor world. It tells us who's in and who's out. In 2011, Fergie was plainly still very much out.
Princesses Beatrice and Eugenie were invited along with their father, but Fergie was left firmly out in the cold.
I've always thought it's incredibly harsh, actually, for the girls to be invited to things like the wedding of William and Catherine, you know, prominent role in that, and their mother not to be there.
The wounds were still raw for the royal family, and the split between the Windsors and Sarah Ferguson seemed irreparable.
When she wasn't invited to Kate and William's wedding, it was extremely hurtful for her. As she said to me, you know, she was the last girl to go down that aisle. Sarah felt a real knife in the heart that she couldn't be with her daughters. That was a real nail in the coffin for Sarah.
But even the princess's appeal only went so far with the Windsors. Andrew and brother Charles had reportedly been at odds for years over the role of the princesses in the future of the royal family.
He wanted them to be treated as senior royals, and they're not really. He wanted all the trappings, the money, the protection that goes with that role. And he foresaw their future as being full-time working royals. This is not how Prince Charles sees it. He wants a slimmed-down monarchy, and he didn't want them being part of the royal finances.
For Fergie herself, there was to be a glimmer of hope. After Prince William's wedding, the Queen started cautiously inviting Sarah to some events.
She's occasionally invited to Balmoral. She's been to Ascot. I think the Queen is mellowing in her old age. I think very tentatively the Queen is sort of saying, OK, look, we're just going to try this, but if you put a foot wrong, it will all stop again.
Then in 2018, there was a thawing of relations. Prince Andrew and his daughters were invited to the wedding of Prince Harry and Meghan Markle. But so too was a new key guest.
When Harry and Meghan married, he made it very clear that Fergie should be invited to the formal wedding.
Harry was probably using the invitation as a sort of a reconciliation, an olive branch. He knew that Fergie was not popular with some members of the royal family, but he wanted her there because she was important to him and to his childhood.
Harry was not the only royal getting married that year. Princess Eugenie had her self-found love and was due to marry Jack Brooksbank only months later. It was to be a test of the status of Andrew and Sarah Ferguson in the royal family.
Princess Eugenie's wedding to Jack Brooksbank was really the string that pulled Fergie back onto the periphery of the royal family, because she's mother of the bride. There's no way that she couldn't be invited, and I think it was a uniting of the families.
If there's any link, positive link, between the Fergusons and the Windsor, it will be the two daughters. So there's almost an inevitability about Sarah being with members of the House of Windsor because of their children.
But while the Queen had been cautiously warming towards Fergie, this didn't extend to her husband.
For many, many years, Philip absolutely refused to have anything to do with Fergie at all. And if she walked into a room, if she happened to walk into a room, which was pretty rare, he'd exit stage left immediately.
It was Sarah Ferguson, who had walked down the aisle 32 years before, who was the most nervous on the big day.
Having not been part of the royal family for so long, she didn't want to put a foot wrong. She only just beat the bride to the door of St George's Chapel, and she'd gone out just waving, and she was like on ebullient form.
But as the guests gathered inside the chapel, there was some nervousness around the arrival of a key royal guest.
There was a huge amount of speculation before Eugenie's wedding about whether Philip would finally give way and be in the same building as Fergie. He managed to make it to St George's Chapel and took his place in the ceremony, not far from Fergie.
Fergie had a qualified return to the fold as guest of honour in the heart of Windsor Castle, for her daughter would always be a Windsor. But within a year, it all came tumbling down. This time it wasn't Sarah, but Andrew who fell spectacularly from grace. 2019, new details of Andrew's long-term friendship with convicted paedophile Jeffrey Epstein emerged.
The Epstein scandal really seems to have tentacles that reach out and have enveloped Andrew's family because, well, Jeffrey Epstein was a guest at Princess Beatrice's 18th birthday party. You know, he's a family friend. When Fergie was in one of her many money troubles, she turned to him for a loan. So it's very intertwined, really.
He decided to do this interview. It was the wrong move. Just was a total disaster. Just the worst interview I think anyone has seen.
This is ITV News with Alistair Stewart.
Good evening. Prince Andrew's explosive Newsnight interview last night has today been judged to have blown up in his face.
It was to be a scandal too far for the royal family and for the Queen. 4 days after he was interviewed by Newsnight, Andrew gave up his royal duties.
There's no template here. He can't stop being the Queen's son. He can't stop being a member of the royal family. All he can do is no longer represent or work for that family.
The tables had turned. After years of Andrew standing firm in the face of Fergie's scandals, it was now his ex-wife who was supporting Andrew as he found himself distanced from the Windsors.
There's this huge loyalty, which I think actually comes from, Fergie's side of the family. This great loyalty that their father instilled in them. It's a very strong trait in Fergie and the two children.
2020 was to be a new era for the family. For Fergie, none of her family were any longer working royals.
She's carved out her own career. She goes from project to project now. I mean, her latest project is writing, or co-writing, a Mills and Boon romantic thriller.
It may not only be in fiction that Sarah Ferguson is thinking about romance. Fergie and Andrew's close relationship has fueled rumours that they could retie the knot.
Will Sarah and Andrew marry again? Will they remarry? Never say never, that's what I say. I'd love it if they did. I think the girls would love it. Whether they will or not is another thing.
I think Andrew and Fergie are the most married divorced couple that I know of, but real marriage? No, not a chance in hell. She doesn't want to get back into the straitjacket of royal life. She wouldn't be accepted anyway. There's no place for Fergie.
One thing is for certain, in royal circles, Fergie will never be forgotten.
Fergie would never be free of the Windsors. The Windsors were never going to be free of Fergie.
Because those two royal princesses are the bond between the Fergusons and the royal family.
They really do bring the royal family together, and that is thanks to Sarah, because she's been the most wonderful mother to these girls.
They will remain in the public eye. They will remain of public interest. And so that bond will never be severed.